Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think recognizing that we're all, trying to work through this together, and I know you attempted on the Zoom earlier, so, I think that would be fine. So we'll go ahead and skip over you, Ms. Pellegrini,
Alex.
and we'll go to, on my list, I have Ms. Odette Ransom.
Hey, Gavin.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, council member Matt. I would just like to remind too that, if folks are having technical issues, such as that, we do have space available where we could help coordinate that, and they could, come to the common room at the borough building to present to make sure that that's not an issue in the future.
Thanks for that reminder, Mr. Castiglia. That's a great point, and that's another option, Ms. Pellegrini, if you're still having trouble when we get around to the next night of party objectors.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Alex, are we able to locate Ms. Ransom?
I do not see her in the attendees list. If she's here, if she can raise her hand, that would be great. And we can promote her to a panelist or unmute her from the attendees group.
Ms. Ransom, if you're with us, please identify yourself. Alex, did you see her at all in the this evening?
No, sir.
Okay. Okay, well, that's another one to circle. Hopefully we can, use this last now 25 minutes of time to continue working through our party objectors here while we're all together. We have Mr. Saunders, Bill Saunders next. I think I did see Mr. Saunders.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Thanks to the council for giving us all a chance to speak. My name is William Saunders of 8 Holland Road. I know you've heard many comments from numerous speakers in support of the application. Nearly all of these proponents are paid to support the applicant. The lawyers, the experts, all of them paid money to support the applicant. And if they didn't support the applicant, they would not have been allowed to testify. Please keep that in mind when you're reviewing that testimony. With the exception of Mr. Fitzgerald and maybe one or two others, none of us are paid. We are speaking from our hearts and are only here because we want to see what's best for Churchill, not because someone is paying us to agree with them. Amazon is one of the wealthiest corporations in the world. They can use other sites for a warehouse, sites that will not impact the lives of nearby community as it will here in Churchill. Because anyone who believes a 3 million square foot distribution center with hundreds, maybe thousands of trucks and even more cars won't negatively impact traffic, noise, and pollution is simply a fool. Amazon has the resources to buy a site that is further from homes and schools. We don't have the money and resources of Amazon, but we have one thing going for us. We have you. You are elected representatives who are charged with protecting our community and our well-being. Please listen to your neighbors, listen to the objectors, listen to the protesters, listen to the petition signers and the signs you see on the lawns. Someone may be telling you that you don't have a choice, that you have to vote yes. They are lying to you. Every elected representative has a right to vote yes or no, according to their judgment and the will of their constituents. If there are consequences of a no vote, we will face those consequences together. We will stand with you if you stand with us. So I ask you, have the courage to vote with your constituents. The building code gives you the power to reject nuisance projects that negatively impact the quality of life in Churchill. This has been detailed for you multiple times and in multiple ways, including tonight. You can vote with your neighbors and residents against the Amazon Distribution Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Saunders. Mr. Gallagher, any cross-examination for Mr. Saunders?
Just one question. Mr. Saunders, are you a professional traffic operations engineer?
I am not, but I don't need to speak common sense to the council.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. Are there any other questions for Mr. Saunders from any other objectors? We'll give it about 10, 15 seconds here. And understanding the council may have questions themselves, we'd ask that Mr. Spurties, whose name I also mispronounce regularly, so I hope correct me on that, I'm sure, would be queued up. Even if we don't get through all of his, we could certainly, it's up to council, but we could certainly get started on that. Assuming there's not lengthy examination by council now. So I don't see any other objectors seeking to question Mr. Saunders. Are there any questions from Borough Council? All right, hearing none and seeing none. Why don't we turn to Mr. Spurties? Maybe you can give us an idea of how long he expects his testimony to go, and we can make a determination as to the best course of action after hearing from him.
I'm actually not sure. I would think half an hour, 35 minutes, something like that.
Okay, well, that's right around the time that I think we have. Of course, that would split up cross-examination. I'm open to hearing from, especially certainly Borough Council. If any Borough Council members have a feeling one way or the other, we have to. Since I'm not with you, maybe you can communicate amongst yourselves. Talk to Alex. Let us know. And in the meantime, I'll ask Mr. Gallagher, Mr. Metz, Mr. Ferguson if there's any preference one way or the other.
No preference on our end.
Okay.
The consensus here in the room is that we're willing to stay an extra 10 minutes or so if Mr. Spurties finishes up during that period of time.
Okay. Well, that'll be fine. Then we'll at least get started. And again, we have promised the court reporter and closed captioner we would finish as close to 11 as possible. So we'll just see where things stand. And you know, because there will likely be cross-examination. I don't think it will be the end of the world if we end up, you know, pushing Mr. Spurtis to a future date to continue. So with that said, Mr. Spurtis, why don't you go ahead and begin your testimony?
Can you see the slides?
Yes.
And I wanted to say you're one of the few people who pronounces my name correctly, so thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So what I wanted to say about the Hillwood project is sort of consists of three parts. That Langen studies have repeatedly claimed that their estimates of the Churchill Creek project are conservative. And what I want to argue is that in many ways that they're not conservative. The second major point that I would like to make is that there are actually a number of large uncertainties associated with Langen's estimates of the effects of this project, which are not mentioned in the studies. And the third thing I want to say is that given those two, that the studies don't demonstrate that the project has satisfied the relevant standards. So let me say something about conservative estimates. So Langen has repeatedly said that their estimates in a variety of different studies are quite conservative, quote, conservative, unquote. So for instance, Mr. Prisk said that, and so logically that means our study's conservative because of higher volumes. Again, so these are just a few examples on this slide here. There are many other ones. So the claim here that Langen makes about their studies is that they're very conservative. And I think we have to ask ourselves what conservative means in this context. Normally, engineering studies have a kind of sensitivity analysis. That is, what they take as their inputs, they consider various possible values for what goes into their inputs and sees what effect that they have on the output. And that's notably missing from the Langen studies. And the reason that they claim that that's okay, that they haven't sort of looked at what would happen under a variety of different values of the inputs, is that they've always sort of given us the worst case, that the input is sort of more extreme than anything that we think could happen in real life. And so rather than looking at sort of how things vary with different values, we'll just give you sort of the worst case kind of input, and that will tell us, that will give us a sort of a level of safety in terms of the conclusions that we draw. So it's important to recognize that conservative here does not mean that you've done the analysis the same way that things have worked in the past, or that would have been appropriate in the past when circumstances are changing. So under changing circumstances, the conservative thing to do is not to do what we've done before, but to take into account how things are changing. So I want to argue that in a number of different ways, Langen's estimates are not conservative, in part because we're dealing with changing circumstances, and in part because there are a number of other inputs that should have been considered that weren't. There are also, what this means is that there's actually a lot of uncertainty about Langen's estimates, where the amount of uncertainty is really not considered. They don't state anything about how certain they are about any of their outputs, any of their estimates. Rather, they just rely on the fact that the so-called conservativeness of their estimates, it will replace having any kind of uncertainty about the estimates. So what I'm going to argue there is that, as a matter of fact, those uncertainties not only exist within individual estimates, but they actually propagate from one estimate to another. And the fact that they're propagating and there are multiple ones means that the uncertainties can actually sort of multiply, and we get increased uncertainties as we sort of aggregate these different inputs together. So I'll skip over these because we've heard these before. The criteria for approval, well, let me just briefly say. The third thing I want to discuss is what the relevant standards are in each case. The relevant standards, sometimes they mention government bodies, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they are simply expressed in terms of not being dangerous, injurious, or noxious. And there's no particular standard that is picked out for that. They are simply given in these sort of terms like health, safety, and welfare. And in effect, they're leaving it up to the council to judge whether health, safety, and welfare have been protected. While I want to argue that in several cases, under that standard, the zoning requirements are different than the ones that are applied by Langen. So in particular, I want to talk about the number of vehicles, the traffic, the noise, the air quality, the vibration, and the sewage. So let's talk about the estimate of the number of vehicles. So the maximum number of vehicles per day was not specified. So in Chris Prisk's testimony on July 14th, 2021, he was asked specifically if he was giving the maximum number of vehicles per day in his simulations and in his study. And what he said was there's a kind of normal operating capacity, and then they do have a few days that have a kind of seasonal influx. simulations are not of those minimal season influx days. They are the typical operating conditions that you will normally experience. So this actually relates to the question that Mr. McDonald raised, which is that as a matter of fact, there's a planned influx that can happen with Amazon. That the normal operating capacity, which is the one used in the traffic study, is not the maximum. So we may not know the exact amount of extra capacity in the Hillwood facility, but we do know that there is extra capacity because it's planned for with the kind of surge that is going to occur. So the number, how large is that surge? We actually don't have information about that. That's not in the study, and it wasn't in Mr. Prisk's testimony either. So we have no sort of upper limit to what the number of vehicles per day could possibly be. We know it's larger than the number that was put into the study, but we don't know how much larger. So that's one of the uncertainties that is very important, because that's going to propagate down to a lot of the other studies. That also means that, as a matter of fact, there is extra capacity in that plan. And if Amazon continues to increase its sales, there's no reason to believe that what may start off as a surge doesn't end up as something much more permanent. So again, we don't know how that, what that number is going to be for how often this surge occurs. Mr. Prisk did say, it's my understanding that the seasonal upticks amount to maybe 14 days. That's what I've been told. Well, again, now we have a great deal of uncertainty. Who told him that? What was that based on? Are we talking about trucks, cars, both? None of that is now in the record. So, nor is it the case that there's any kind of guarantee that even if it's 14 days now, that it won't be 28 days in a couple of years, or 280 days in a couple of years. The capacity, we know there's an excess capacity, and we know that currently someone said that it was 14 days, and that's all we've got. I don't think that's adequate for really understanding what's going to happen in the future to, well, not just in the future, currently, what we're going to see on the roads in Churchill, and let alone what it is we're going to see in the future on the road in Churchill. Just as an illustration of the fact that this affects other estimates that were given, I'm quoting here from the Churchill Borough public hearing on August 9th, where basically Joseph Sabato said, my analysis basically uses the transportation impact study as an input. So in terms of Chris's analysis, we use the peak hour input, which is really what Chris's analysis was geared towards assessing. And I said, as far as I can see, that does not include the surge. And he said, if he is not including the surge, it would not be, well, inflicted. I'm using the the transcript that was provided online. So I think it would not be included in my analysis either. So what we have here is we have uncertainty about the number of vehicles in the going in and out of the plant. That leads to uncertainty in the traffic report because it's not included in the traffic report. But then the traffic report feeds into the other reports, and they are not taking that into account either. So that means we're propagating uncertainties. We don't know the number of vehicles. We don't know the peak number of vehicles. what is called the peak number of vehicles is actually the normal peak number of vehicles, not the surge number of peak vehicles. But of course, the number of vehicles affect that was fed into the traffic report about how long we're going to get delays and how what the intersections are going to look like. It played a role in the noise report, obviously, because that was used. The number of vehicles determines how much noise we're going to have. It's fed into the air quality report, as we have seen. Of course, the traffic report ultimately affects the accident report, and then the accidents, the health, the noise, and the air quality all affect the health and safety. So we have uncertainty in the traffic, and that propagates down through all of the others and throws a considerable question about whether they can be called conservative. None of them can be called conservative because we're not dealing with the right input. And not only does that affect health and safety, but it accumulates because we now have multiple sources of uncertainty that are feeding into the health, into estimates of the health and safety. With respect to the air quality, I will be relatively brief because that is to some extent repetitive of what Dr. Gentile attested to. So again, the estimate of air quality is not, so what I want to say about air quality is that the estimate of the air quality is not conservative, and the standard by which air quality is judged is not the correct standard. So why do I think it's not conservative? Well, air quality is highly dependent upon weather. So if we look at the government site, National the NOAA, they say that, as a matter of fact, heat waves, droughts, wildfires, cold waves, snowfall, and flooding can all affect air and water quality. During heat waves, the air becomes stagnant and traps emitted pollutants. Now, the weather in the future will be significantly different than the weather over the past 5 years. What went in as input to the air quality estimate, as we'll see in a minute, was data about the weather over the last 5 years. However, what we would expect in the future is that all of these things, heat waves, droughts, wildfires, snowfall, flooding, all of these things which affect air and water quality are going to be significantly worse over the next 20 years and over the next 40 years. So in that sense, the projections of air quality that are based on the weather of the last 5 years will not be conservative. So to back that up, let's just look at the IPCC report on climate change. This is the physical science basis summary for policymakers. And exactly what they say is that all of these things are going to be getting worse. The surface temperature will continue to increase under every emission scenario considered. So they considered 5 different scenarios for what would happen to global surface temperature, and these were based upon different policies that could be adopted globally. Under all of those policies, we're going to see global surface temperatures increase. We're going to see many changes in the climate system become larger in direct relation. In particular, the frequency and intensity of hot extremes and heavy precipitation. So, when Mr. Sabato was asked about whether or not he had taken into account the fact that we have the report that is inevitable that we, over the next 20 years, the next 40 years, we will see warmer temperatures, which will in turn lead to more extreme weather events, his answer was that the impacts of climate change were not included in my analysis. Our analysis relies upon 5 years of hourly weather data, which is designed to sort of give a series of atmospheric conditions that the project could exist under. At the August 8th public hearing. So let me skip over this and simply go here. This is examples of the estimates of how we are going to be affected by climate change in terms of extreme weather events. So if we take here under the column present 1 degree centigrade, that's now, something that a weather event that would have occurred with respect to temperature once in 10 years in the period from 1850 to 1900 is now 2.8 times more likely. What we're going to get in the future, as we look here, as under different scenarios where it'll be either 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or 4 degrees warmer, we'll then get 4.1 times as many of those events, or 5.6 if it's a 2 degree raise, or 9.4 if it's a 4 degree raise. So what that means is that these heat waves are going to be occurring much more often. And remember that heat waves is one of the things that is going to affect the air quality in 2 separate ways. It's going to change the base level of how bad the air is, and it's also going to change how much pollution that is emitted will increase the base level. So we're going to have a higher base level, and we're going to have a bigger increase for the same amount of pollution emitted in all of these scenarios. And similarly, if we look at 50-year events, then what we can see is that we're going to be 8.6 times more likely than in the past, or 13.9 if it's a 2 degree raise, or 39.2 if it's a 4 degrees raise. So under all these scenarios, we're going to get much more extreme temperature events. We're also going to get much more extreme precipitation events. And I won't go through these again, but the basic idea is similar. Under every scenario, these future global warming levels, we're going to get 1.5 or 1.7 or 2.7 times more likely for these heavy precipitation events. So what that means is that climate change is going to affect air quality 2 different ways. It's going to affect air quality because the base level of pollution is going to go up, and it's going to affect air quality because even if we emit the same amount of pollution, the effect, the change that we get over the base level will be larger. I'm going to skip over this because this was covered by Sandy Fox and Ruthie Ray and Dr. Gentile, but this just is saying that the standard that we ought to be using in this case is not the current value of the NAAQS, but we should be looking at either the proposed changes that are almost certainly going to come because they were recommended strongly, and we would expect those to occur by 2023, or the World Health Organization. And in those cases, in both of those cases, basically, even if the Epsilon air quality model is accepted under both the World Health Organization and the proposed standards, Churchill would currently be in violation of those standards for PM 2.5. The point is that if we're already in violation and the Churchill Creek project would make the violation worse, which is what they admit up here, because it would increase the amount of PM 2.5, that would make it harder for Churchill to come into compliance. So even if we were already not in compliance, we shouldn't say, oh, well, then anything goes. What we should say is that's every reason not to make things worse. That's going to make compliance harder. And similarly, if we look at the PM, I'm sorry, that was the, yeah, I'm sorry, that should be the PM 10. This one is the PM 2.5. So again, the combined background plus modeled PM 2.5 would be estimated to be 24.22, which would be just barely below the World Health Organization recommended standard. And if, as a matter of fact, there was any kind of significant error at all in the Epsilon air quality model, which I believe is overly optimistic and overly certain about the results, it would put Churchill above the World Health Organization recommended standards. So we would be moving from acceptable to unacceptable. So I'm guessing I have another 15 minutes, or should I?
I think, Mr. Sperdes, thanks for acknowledging that. And I don't want you to have to rush through your testimony. I also know that, like I said, we have a captioner and a court reporter who are planning on shutting things down at 11, plus there'll be some cross-examination, I'm sure. So we will go ahead and I think stop here. Have you, can I ask, have you submitted this presentation?
No, I have not submitted. I will submit it, and I will send all the exhibits.
Thank you very much. That's helpful, just to make sure it helps people understand your testimony, allows them to have an educated cross-examination as well. And it, gives it to the council in advance, so they have the ability to view it while you're going through it. So thank you for that. Let me go ahead and if you could stop sharing your screen, Mr. Sperdes.
Let me try and stop sharing my screen. Where? I'm sorry, somehow I've lost.
No worries. Take your time.
Stop share. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay. So we actually did make a good deal of progress tonight. By my count, it looks like we do have still Ms. Starrett, Mr. Wilson, Ms. Yankus, Mr. McMullen, Ms. Kasman, and then possibly if we hear from Ms. Donsky, that would be the remainder of the unrepresented party objectors. As discussed, we are going to allow Mr. Ferguson to sort of jump in on Thursday to present his case, his expert witnesses and his lay witnesses, hopefully. That hearing will be on August 26th, starting at 6 p.m. That will be part 7, the 7th installment of this hearing. And I would ask, and I need to confirm this with council members, but I would ask folks to take a look at their calendars for August 31st. So we won't be announcing that officially yet. We'll see where we get on Thursday. But Tuesday, August 31st is under consideration as a possible finish the unrepresented party objector day. And if there's any of Attorney Ferguson's presentation left over, we could possibly cover that as well. State, yes.
Point of order. I mean, did Dwight say that his presentation is going to take the whole time, or should these unrepresented folks be prepared to present Thursday as well?
Mr. Castilla, maybe it's just having been through six hearings so far, but I would be surprised if we have time left over after Mr. Ferguson's witnesses. I don't know how many he plans on putting on, but we can go ahead. Why don't we ask Mr. Ferguson if he has a sense as to how long his case may go since he's with us?
I think there will probably be some time at the end.
Okay. Well, that's optimistic, Mr. Ferguson, and I like optimism. That's fantastic, even at this late hour. So
it may just be naive or delirium, but
whatever we want to call it. So in light of that, I would ask then, Mr. Sperdes, if you could be prepared to finish your testimony, possibly, hopefully, on Thursday evening. And then also, after that, we have Ms. Starrett and Mr. Wilson. And the order, I think, is posted on the website and will be updated, hopefully. And Mr. Graziani, if I'm not imposing upon you to update the remainder of those party objectors so that everyone's working off the same list. And then I would just generally state as well that if there are folks who are submitting exhibits, if you could please make sure that those are submitted to the borough manager as soon as possible so that they can be marked and placed on the website and viewed by all, in fairness to all parties. With that said, we did announce so we're only officially announcing the August 26th date at 6 p.m. We'll reserve the right potentially to go August 31st. We'll see about that. And September dates at this point have not been determined, but we still do have time where I believe the tree committee, gateway engineers, and then ultimately any sub-consultants and ultimately public comment, which may need its own evening. We'll have to wait and see on that. So with that said, Mr. Metz, Mr. Gallagher, am I forgetting anything from your perspective?
No, that you covered it all. It would be greatly appreciated if we could have the party exhibits beforehand, as you had mentioned, but that was it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ferguson, anything else from you before we adjourn?
No, nothing further. Thank you.
Okay, great. We'll see you for your case on Thursday at 6 p.m. Same Zoom format. Alex, anything I'm missing?
No, sir.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your continued patience in this matter, and we'll see everyone in a couple days.